Hi, I'm Alex Fraycon. You're listening to My Therapist and I, a podcast that isn't just about therapy, it is therapy. More specifically, my therapy. Each week I'll sit down with my therapist, Dr. Stephen Harris of the University of Minnesota. We'll talk about whatever's on my mind, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And you get to be a fly on the wall from wherever it is that you choose to listen to. In our first episode, it's our first time meeting each other. There's always a little bit of awkwardness in that first session, so we spend a bit of time introducing ourselves, and then I get into what brings me to therapy and what I hope to accomplish by working with Dr. Harris. So with that said, hope you enjoy. Hello. I don't know, how do I even start this? How do I even begin? This is a podcast. Welcome to the, hopefully, we will see, first episode of My Therapist and I, which is a podcast that is not just about therapy. It is therapy, and which is a kind of crazy concept. I don't know that it's been done before. I know that there are a lot of podcasts about therapy, but I don't know that there are any that kind of show you what therapy is like. So what this podcast is effectively, I, Alex, am, whoever is listening, I'm kind of your guinea pig here. I am going to go through an example, so to speak, of what therapy is like for the sole purpose of you being able to get a feeling for what it's like. And the reason being is, I truly believe that therapy is a wonderful thing, which that's something I'll get into. But I feel like there's a lot of stigma around it, and there's a lot of hesitation to dive into it because it can be very intimidating. I believe that it doesn't have to be. And I want to show people what the process of therapy is like so that they can understand it's a really comfortable process and it is super dope, super awesome. So this podcast, if you're curious about therapy, if you've ever wondered what it's like, this podcast is for you. If you are in therapy and you want to know what other people's experiences are like, this podcast is for you. If you're a therapist and you want to know what your patients might be thinking and what their experience is like, this podcast hopefully is for you. Basically, this podcast is hopefully for everyone. I am not alone. I know I've been talking for a long time, but I am accompanied by, do you want me to call you Professor Steve Harris, or how do you want to work with me?
Yeah, you can call me Steve. I mean,
okay.
That's my name, so that's what I go by.
I am joined, obviously it's called My Therapist and I. I'm joined by Steve here. He is going to be kind of my acting therapist, my podcast therapist, if you will.
Podcast therapist.
The reason I say podcast therapist, and Steve and I have talked about this, it's really important at the upfront that I kind of explain, Steve is effectively my podcast therapist. The reason that I feel comfortable doing this is because, I've been in therapy for 15 plus years. So I have experience with therapy. I also currently have a therapist, a real life therapist outside of this podcast. So I feel comfortable, whatever we discuss here, I have a safety net, if you will. We'll get into this, but long story short, this is not, Steve is not responsible for my mental health or well-being beyond this podcast or anything like that. Like, I have checks and balances in place. With that said, Steve, why don't you kind of introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Steve Harris. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist in the state of Minnesota. I've been here in Minnesota for about 13 years. I am also a professor at the University of Minnesota, where I teach couple and family therapy in the Department of Family Social Science. So the reason, I decided to kind of try this out with Alex to see what benefit it might have for listeners out there who are wondering about mental health, wondering about accessing services, to maybe take some of the stigma out of what therapy is about. And there's been a lot of talk in the news lately about mental health issues. Simone Biles at the Olympics, sitting out from a gold medal performance, or what would have been a gold medal performance, for her mental health issues, and other athletes. And so we're in an era where we're expanding the dialogue on mental health, and I thought that this might be a place where Alex and I could make a contribution to expand the dialogue in mental health. And That being said, I appreciate Alex talking about he's got a safety net, checks and balances. He's got his own therapist, and but my background. My background is in couple and family therapy, so I approach therapy that I do with individuals, couples, families, from a relational perspective. Basically, what that means is it means that I think relationships are really important and have a big impact on how we experience life and how we experience our mental and emotional wellness. They can be the kinds of things that bring us down. They can be the kinds of things that lift us up. And so that relational perspective is always going to kind of take the priority in my mind as I think about what someone might be coming in to talk about in therapy. So,
which again, yeah. So Steve and I had been chatting in terms of like, okay, this podcast. There are a lot of podcasts that talk about therapy, and that there's professionals who talk about mental health, and I definitely I want to have that like professional perspective, but it is my hope that the majority of this focus is the experience of therapy by talk the talk or walk the walk rather. Showing is telling. So and Steve had said the majority of my practice is with couples. Is that going to be weird? And from my perspective, no. And also we'll find out. Like maybe
might be weird.
Yeah, as I talk about the stuff going on in my life, maybe you're like, okay, like this isn't for me. Like we will explore that. But again, to anyone listening, the goal here is for you to see or listen to what therapy is like. So it won't just be us talking about it. It'll be us doing, it. Therapy in practice. I'm going to turn the AC on because I'm getting a little, I don't know if you're feeling.
I'm fine.
I'm getting a little, so this might mess up the sound, but I don't care because I'm already sweating. Maybe it's just the anticipation.
I think there's more pressure on you than there is on me.
Maybe it's just the anticipation from having, like, I cannot emphasize the amount of work that has gone into making this a reality just because, we wanted to be so sure. The therapy, it's a regulated thing and it is I don't know how you would describe it, like it's a medical service. It's in the sense like there are lines that you don't want to cross, and you want to make sure that boundaries are in place. So we had to do a lot of I had to do a lot of work to make sure that this thing could be done in a safe way. But that's just me kind of ranting. I think where I wanted to start, and what I'm going to call this episode, is the kind of famous line that I feel like every therapist has used once in their life, which is, so tell me why you're here. Is that a line that you have used before?
Yeah. What do you want to talk about today?
Yeah.
What's on your mind about our work together?
Yeah.
Those kinds of things.
So that's definitely what I want the name of this episode to be. But I kind of want to use it as like use it as a moment to talk about what it is like having a first session.
Yeah. Okay.
And I'll be open and honest with you. Like I'm a pretty confident guy, and I've been in therapy for 15 years.
Yeah.
I still was a little nervous this morning. I don't know how to describe it other than maybe it was like excitement, but like there is something to be said about being vulnerable with a complete stranger. And I think that is one thing that, not something that I struggle with, but like it definitely runs through the mind is like, okay, for me as a patient, going to a therapist, it's like my goal is to share things that trouble me or things I want to work on, things that are deeply personal. And I don't know how to describe it. Maybe it's counterintuitive, or maybe it just feels, it can be really intimidating to share with someone you don't know. I
mean, in agreement with what you're saying, Alex, I think that it's a big thing to take that first step and to call somebody you don't know, to divulge things about yourself that you may be embarrassed about or maybe struggling with. It takes a huge leap of faith. It takes a huge risk. And you know, becoming vulnerable, being vulnerable is kind of a catchphrase. If you've ever watched The Bachelor, you know, that's the thing you hear all the time. I feel like I can be vulnerable with you. And,
Yeah.
you know, vulnerability, I think that vulnerability is one way that people can achieve intimacy in relationships. It's one way that they can be known by another person. But it's also one way to really put yourself out there and get hurt. So
Yeah.
Going to therapy for the first time is a big risk. There's a lot of great therapists out there, and there are some other therapists who are not so great.
Yeah.
You know, like any profession, right? Some plumbers are really great, and other plumbers are not so great. So you've got all kinds of people in the profession who have ideas about what works, what helps people, and those ideas may not always fit with the person that's sitting down next to you. So the person who's sitting next to you is taking a risk. I always keep that in the back of my mind. Like, okay, it took a lot of courage to make that call.
Yeah.
It took a lot of courage to drive to this office or to get on that Zoom call as we've been doing the last couple of years. But yeah, huge step to take. And sometimes it's so hard that people don't come back. One of the things we know about therapy is one session is the modal number, meaning that's the most number of sessions the general population gets is one therapy session, and a lot of people flame out. They drop out really quickly. Maybe they're getting what they need in that one session, but I suspect a lot of people don't have a good fit with their therapist, so they do one session here, maybe one session there. Some people raise their hands and give up. Other people hit with a good therapist or with a good connection with a therapist, and stay the course. But yeah, it can be a tough venture, and we often don't. We put on therapists a different kind of expectation than we do our other medical professionals that we interact with.
Well, yeah, I think hearing that definitely makes me feel better, just because it's like you appreciate the fact that like we don't really know each other, and I'm going to be sharing things that, you know, are deeply personal. And I don't know, maybe it's just as you said, it just feels kind of unnatural to. Maybe it's just the way that we're conditioned. Like I personally, so I come from a family, and this is probably you're not going to be surprised to hear this as a Minnesotan, but like there were certain things that you did not share with anyone. Like there were many times growing up where, you know, our family would experience something, not necessarily traumatic, but you know, it would carry some kind of weight, and the first thing that was made clear was like, okay, we're not going to talk about this with anyone. Like this stays between us. And I think, you know, growing up, and again, I think that's pretty typical, but I think over time that kind of teaches you to be like, okay, if you share these things with other people, you're going to get judged, and like I don't know what the ultimate fear is. Maybe like personally, it's this fear that like I'm going to, like you can get hurt, you know, you can be met with this like, hey, you're weird, or like you're an outcast. I don't like you because of what you think or what you feel. And
well, we learn all kinds of lessons from our families, right? And one of them is you learn about how you're supposed to be in relation to the rest of the world, right? So something happens that pushes your boundaries of comfort, or maybe it's a traumatic experience that you mentioned, and that then the family has kind of an implicit message about, we don't talk about this, or we share this with everyone, and so you get a glimpse into how your family is run. Like what are our boundaries like? Are we an open book, or are we kind of reserved? Is there a select few people? Maybe it's people in our religious community, maybe it's people in our work environment that we open up to. But yeah, you learn things growing up in a family that kind of you carry with you through your whole life, right? We call that our family of origin. And so people develop ways of looking at the world largely informed by how our parents did things. And they got their information from how their parents did it. So you have multiple generations. And here in the upper Midwest, you know, we've got great great tradition of hardworking, Finns and Swedes and Norwegians and people who, hard workers, but also not a lot of people who were trained to talk about the feeling part of their world.
Yeah.
And I don't mean to exclude any other nationalities who came here and settled here, but it's got we have an interesting background here in the upper Midwest. So
Minnesota Nice and like repression is something that creatively I play with all the time. Like it's such a fascinating subject matter to me. And so for my family, like it was always unique because my dad is from, he was born and raised in Morocco, but he spent the majority of, up until he was 16, then he moved to Paris. So he grew up in Paris. So he is like the antithesis of Minnesota Nice in the sense that like if he thinks it or he feels it,
he's going to say it.
Yeah. In an enclosed with like a circle of people that he trusts, he's very reserved in some regards, but for the most part, like extremely blunt. So I have seen the other side, I guess. But I am still repressed, so it's like a constant battle between like I feel inclined to express these things. However, my environment is such that if I express these things, I'm met with a lot of awkwardness and like silence, So one thing that I think struggle with, and this is kind of one of the things that brought me here, so to speak, is I have a really tough time with like just general human intimacy in the sense of like, I don't know. I find myself feeling quite isolated quite often. And I struggle with this idea of like, well, I want to be able to connect with people and share how I'm feeling and talk about stuff like emotions and hopes and dreams. And it can be increasingly challenging to do that. And I don't know if that's just my environment or I don't know if that's like male culture. Dudes tend to not want to or default to talking about feelings. But just kind of notion of just it can be a lonely road. Also, I have a kind of, I guess you would call it a history of just anxiety. I've experienced a lot of anxiety. It started as a kid when I was about, I want to call it like 10-ish. I started to get panic attacks, and it was getting to the point where I was probably having them at the very least once a month, most likely a few times a month. That kind of tapered off. But by the time I was like 18, I would say. However, I don't know, it just seems to have kind of left this impression of just not... It's been described, my other therapist calls it low-grade fight or flight, just constant, where it's like, this feeling of like, okay, I know everything's okay, but deep down there's this feeling of like, okay, something's wrong, or I'm in danger, or like I need to be focused and I need to be vigilant. And so I just kind of have that all the time. And like, it's something that I manage and I have things in place, and, exercising is really important. And
Alex, when you had panic attacks when you were 10-ish, as you said, did you have, like, what were they like?
Yeah. So it's a kind of a weird story. I trace it back to, I was sitting in my TV room and I was watching TV, and I turned off the TV and it was silent. The room was silent. And for whatever reason at that moment, I realized, I confronted this notion of death. And I was like, wait a minute. When I die, the TV turns off. I don't get to change the channel. Everything's done. There's no more. There's nothing. And I know articulating that's probably not as profound as how I felt it when I was 10, but like it scared me so deeply. I just realized what it meant to die. And so at that point, I became very fixated on, okay, am I sick? Am I dying? So my panic attacks were often triggered by this notion of like, okay, something's wrong with me. I was constantly kind of checking my pulse. If I've had a headache, I was like, oh no, it's a brain tumor. So what these panic attacks would be is just this like, I'd work up. I'd be kind of in a room pacing back and forth. I'd start hyperventilating. I never passed out or anything like that, but there was one particular one that got so elevated where I started seeing spots and like everything kind of went hazy. My ears popped, like I thought I was going to faint. But it just was this like working up to this point of just panic. I don't know how else to describe it. It's just this feeling that like I convinced myself that I was within 30 seconds of dying. Like this was it. I was going to die.
Yeah. I was on a flight like that once, but it was because the plane was about to...
Actually?
Yeah, it was really crazy. Anyway, that's a side story.
I mean, that's like that feeling when I see other people, I've seen other people have panic attacks and I feel immediately want to console them and let them know like, dude, I know what you're going through. It's okay. It is a terrifying experience. And the only thing I can say is like, you really don't know it until you experience it.
Yeah. When someone has a panic attack, that's the first thing they say. I felt like I was going to die. And so panic attacks can lead to other things. So for me, my mind goes to Alex as a 10-year-old, like when you turn the TV off and the picture goes dead, and back in the day, the picture would reduce to a dot. I don't know if it was one of those old tube TVs.
Yeah,
right?
It was.
And you think, oh crap, is that my life being reduced to a dot? And then now the dot's gone. And so for me, as a therapist who thinks relationally, I'm like, who did you tell? Did you go and talk to anybody about that? Did you have a moment where you could go talk to your dad, your mom, sibling, somebody where you would say, I had this moment, like talk to me more about death, or now I'm preoccupied with death and what it means. And that probably brings in a lot of what you were being taught as a kid, either maybe there were spiritual overtones in your home, or maybe the religious influences and things like that. So that's one of the things I'd want to know. Who did you talk to?
So, let me throw out another disclaimer. I'm going to talk about aspects of my life, that other people are involved, and I want to be sensitive to that too, right? Because I don't want to pass judgment on anyone.
Yeah.
And so it'll be this weird line of us walking, and I might just throw up a like pass sign where it's like, okay, we'll figure it out. But I love my parents. I love my family deeply. We're all getting through the best we can. I had no one to talk to, unfortunately. And I think that's what caused it to grow.
Yeah.
Because when I did try to have conversations, it was it was like, well, why are you thinking about that? Like, dude, calm down. Like, stop. Like, you're being ridiculous. And
you're not gonna die.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Like it was basically like you're being ridiculous. Like and I almost started to feel ashamed of feeling this way and embarrassed. So I would be like, okay, I got to keep this to myself because if my parents find out that I'm doing this again, I'm going to get into trouble, and I don't want to get into trouble. So I'll just deal with this on my own.
What's wrong with me that I'm thinking about this?
Yeah. Honestly, and I guess it sort of just conditions you to think there is something wrong with me, right? Because if it was okay, I would be met with, hey, okay, let's talk about it, or like, don't worry, this is totally normal, or like, you're not in trouble, or anything like that. But I think what was tough for my parents is like, at first they were like, oh, it's okay, don't worry, you're just excited. But it consistently kept happening. And the more that it happened, the more sick of it they got and the more frustrated by it they got. And so it just developed to this point where I was like, okay, if I bring this up, I am going to get into trouble. I'm going to get yelled at. So I have to deal with this on my own.
But the thing is, and not knowing your folks or anything like that, but it could have brought up for them like like maybe they were unsure about it as well. Like I think when your kid comes to you and talks to you about death, all you have to rely on is what your beliefs are about death. About my own TV screen going blank, and do I believe that there's anything on the other side? What messages of hope do I give? Or maybe I feel that there's nothing afterwards. Maybe I don't have a belief in the afterlife, and so when my kid talks about it, I'm like, yeah, unfortunately, that's all you got. But I didn't want to burst my kid's bubble, and yet I couldn't really get behind telling my son some fantasy that I don't really believe in, that there's this glorious afterlife or whatever, right? So it may be the kind of thing that your parents struggled with as well. Like, what do we do? He's talking about this. Is he suicidal? Is he having death fantasies? And so you never know what the challenges are that when you as a child bring something to your parents. And I always believe that for the most part, parents are trying to do the best that they can. They do the best that they can with what they got, including the lessons that they got from their folks, et cetera, those generational patterns. And so So and there is a whole bunch of therapists who will say, "Oh, your parents didn't rise to the occasion, and they were abusive, or they were toxic, or whatever." I don't know. If I don't have a chance to meet the parents and talk with them,
Yeah.
I rarely go down that road.
Yes.
Based on what my client has said.
Yeah,
I always
I
want
appreciate
to.
that.
I want to take that belief that parents are always trying to do the best that they can, and I know that there are abusive parents out there. I know that happens. I don't know that it happens to the degree that a lot of therapists think, but anyway.
Well, it's very easy. Like I think the big cliche of therapy is like you go to see a therapist, they tell you, you tell them what's been bothering you, they sit there, they take notes, and then they look at you and they say, yeah, it's your parents' fault. Okay, our time's up. That'll be $200. Like that would be kind of the joke, right? But I think through my work, I've spent a lot of time grappling with this, like, okay, I have resentment, I have anger, but also too, understanding this notion of family of origin. It has been really, and this has required a ton of work on my end, but like understanding how generational behavior can be, and work that I'm trying to do. Like I have, so another thing, I have anxiety, right? I have a pretty active mind. I have I like to think. I think about a lot of stuff. I think very intensely. Sometimes I can get really frustrated with people because I feel as though they are not putting in the same kind of work that I am. And so when I feel like my boundaries are being crossed, I'm like, well, come on, dude. Like, you should know that you're not supposed to do this. Like, it's pretty obvious. And basically, I can be a little judgmental in terms of like, I don't do this to other people. Why do you do this to me? Mm-hmm. And so work that I have been actively doing is this idea of like, a lot of people don't do things to me. You know, it's rarely personal. It's more often they are a product of their environment. They were raised in a certain way, and it's inevitable that they act this way because this is how their parents acted. That's how their parents acted. That's how their parents' it's just generational. And with that said, I mean, like I am 100% a work in progress, and like I have many flaws, but I am very focused on, trying to fix them all, which is probably its own issue in of itself. But it can lead to me getting angry at people who I feel like aren't putting in the work.
Yeah. But if you can maintain that, like if you're in relationship with coworkers or friends or whatever,
Yep.
and they're not responding the way that you think they should or would like, I mean, to be able to have that kind of understanding, like, hey, maybe they didn't get the same things I got, maybe they didn't have the same upbringing I had. That probably saves you a lot of.
It's
a lot
really
of hassles.
hard to do.
But it's hard to do in the moment,
And
especially when you're driving.
yeah,
Somebody cuts you off, and you don't think, I wonder if the family of origin was
exactly
discourteous,
Like you don't have 15 minutes to go down
Right.
a psychological journey. It's just so easy to assume people are doing things to you, as opposed to doing things because that's just how that's their environment, and it has nothing to do with you, unfortunately. So yeah, that's something. I don't know. I just am like, so I guess let's recap. What brings me to therapy personally, just general anxiety, which I think is a good thing and it's a bad thing. It's a good thing. I'm grateful for my anxiety because I think it's a byproduct of just a really active mind. Like my brain has a lot of energy and it needs outlets. And sometimes when it doesn't get it, it starts to, analysis paralysis, stuff like that. I have a bit of neurosis, I would say, or what I've been told. And then also this notion of like relationships and I think I have unrealistic expectations of other people. I don't know. It can be really demanding, I guess, in a weird way. And I think that's reflective of, I assume everyone is putting in the same amount of work that I am into like, okay, I have these flaws. I should figure them out so I don't negatively affect other people. I'm assuming everyone else is doing this work as well, which is even saying it out loud right now. I'm like, that's crazy, Alex. Like that is ridiculous. But in my brain, it's normal to think that.
Yeah, I think most people are not doing that kind of work.
Yeah. I know. It's crazy for me, and my therapist has said this to me too. It's like, I don't know why though. It's challenging for me to let go of that, and to embrace this idea of like, it's not personal, Alex. Like, it's not, they're not doing this because they want to piss you off or because they want to take advantage of your niceness. They're just going through their own journey and like coping the best way that they can, and they have their own fish to fry. But yeah.
Yeah.
So what do you think of that? What are your first impressions, Steve? Do you still want to do the podcast, Steve?
Well, that's the question, right? I don't know. I mean, sitting here, one of the things I'm reminded of, Alex, one of the things you started with was saying, hey, I've had 15 years of therapeutic experiences, conversations and different therapists and things like that. And so you're not showing up to this venture, this podcast, my therapist and I podcast, a blank slate,
Yeah.
So you come with a maybe a more sophisticated understanding of what this is about. You may have already gone through some of the growing pains that some people experience in therapy, where they're trying to figure out, well, what is this person supposed to do? Is this therapist going to be my cheerleader? Is this person going to diagnose me? Is this person going to put me on the straight and narrow? Is this person going to give me advice, tell me what to do? Most of which therapists don't want to be in that position. We don't want to give people advice. In my opinion, I don't typically give people advice. You should live your life this way, because I don't know where you're coming from. So you and I sit down, we start this journey. I learn about this story that's meaningful to you because you pick it out of all the stories out of your life. You're how old, Alex?
I am 35 years old.
This is one of the easy questions, by the way. So,
yeah, I'm 35.
So out of 35 years of experience, you go to that 10-year-old Alex and the experience of being in that room with the TV. So to me, I think, okay, this is a pivotal story. This is one of the important things that shapes how Alex shows up as a 35-year-old, is this thing that part of this. And I also realize that's in a first session, you're probably not going to give me the golden ticket just yet, right? Okay. I don't know if you've been. There's a new show on Hulu called The Patient with Steve Carell. Steve Carell's a therapist. Have you seen it?
I have not, but I've seen previews for it.
So I'm not giving anything away. I saw the first episode. He's a therapist, and this guy's coming in, and he challenges the client and says, "Hey, you're not." I don't know if the client's name is Alex.
Wow, that would be trippy.
That would be trippy. I don't know if that's true or not, but he says to the client, he says, you come in here, you wear glasses, you don't really give me a lot, you talk about your day. Therapy is this place where you have to go deep. You have to go deep inside yourself. And I think that's probably true for people who work with individual clients a lot. Well, it doesn't turn out so well for Steve Carell based on from the ads. He wakes up one morning chained to a bed, and his client is going to be like, we need to do really deep therapy because I got really big issues. And so some people come to therapy. I think this client even says, the name that you're giving, the name that I gave you is not really my name. And I've had that happen. I've had people after the third or fourth session say, hey, I need to come clean. My name is this. It's not something else. And okay, well, that's how you have to enter. I mean, all those safety measures, because it is a vulnerable thing that I'm doing. I don't know who you are. I need to come and vet you a little bit. I think maybe therapists, we can become callous to the idea that people are supposed to sit down and just kind of open up their most precious stories and things like that. So when I sit here with you, I think, okay, for some reason Alex is giving me this story about him being a 10-year-old. It was pivotal. He's connecting it to panic attacks. I don't know if that's the reality or not, but it's important to you.
Yeah.
And so I have no incentive not to believe what you're saying.
Yeah.
I think that's the other thing, is that I could be lied to, I could be played. I don't have a crystal ball, and I don't know when people are lying or telling you, unless facts aren't kind of lining up that I'm tracking. But most often I tend to believe that people are coming to say what they need to say. And if for some reason they need to give me a false name or not share an experience, I think they're vetting me. I think they're testing me. They're finding out, can I be trusted with their sacred and reverent and traumatic and hurtful and shameful kinds of things.
Yeah. So basically, that's kind of, as I was listening to you talk about that, I think I am doing the same. Like, I'm definitely sizing you up in my brain.
Yeah, I feel it.
But I do that with like the golden ticket, which is kind of crazy and absurd, but maybe that's just a testament to how much work I've done. Is I'm like, okay, Steve, let's cut to the chase. Like, let's really get after it. But I forget often. I totally lose context in terms of what the 15 years of therapy has done for me. And as you were talking, I thought, I went back to the first time. I remember the first time I got therapy, I was in college, and I was so scared. I was so paranoid, and I was so reserved. It was at our student medical center, and I was so afraid that people were going to know I was there to see a therapist. I figured out that, like, if you went there to see the nurse, the nurse would come to you and you'd sit in the waiting room. But if you were going there for mental health, the therapist would come from the therapist wing. And I didn't want my friends to see the therapist come get me. So I told my therapist, I was like, okay, we're going to develop a plan where you just come halfway, I'll look for you, and then I'll come to you. Like, that's how scared I was of people knowing I was going to therapy. So and I was so reserved, but I forget. It's been so long that I forget how intimidating it can be.
Yeah, and that intimidation that may not that may be specific to a certain person. Like I've had clients before. I worked in a university counseling center when I was doing my graduate training. And I've had clients that I would run into on campus who wouldn't acknowledge my existence.
That was me. I would do that.
And then I had another person who shouted across the quad, "There's my shrink," and yelled at me, "Hey, Steve!" And she's telling all her friends, and so. People are at different levels of comfort with that, and of course the conversation around mental health is, like I said earlier, is expanding right now. So, and I think it's as someone who was very afraid of therapy and I had a graduate student. I was 19 and he was a graduate student, and he had a camera set up and he's like, "Hey, can I record this for part of my course?" Right.
And I was like, absolutely not. And he's like, okay. And he turned it off, and I kept looking at the camera, and he was like, I noticed you keep looking at the camera. And I told him, I was like, I don't think you've turned it off. I thought he had tricked me. So he was like, okay. And he took the camera apart, and he took it off the tripod, and he hid it, like he put it away in a closet. But like, I was so afraid of being vulnerable. I was so paranoid that this person was going to use this information against me. Mm-hmm. And that came from, my family of origin. Like, do not share this with anyone. Yeah. If they find out, they will use it against you. They will, manipulate you, or, it was like, I grew up in a very competitive environment. Yeah. And they looked at this kind of vulnerability as a weakness. Sure. And it will be used against you. So, and I was going once a week for, I think by the end of the school year, I was like, okay, I feel more comfortable talking about things. But if I seem sort of like I'm diving right in, it's almost a little bit surreal for me to have this conversation, because it's taking me back to like, okay, I was vastly different 15 years ago.
Right.
Yeah.
This is reminding me of a conversation I had with a friend of mine who he lost both his parents in an airplane accident. His father was a pilot, and his parents died when he was in high school in a plane crash. And he, surprisingly or ironically, whichever you want to look at it, went got his pilot's license and interviewed for a pilot's job at a big company. And part of that was to have a psych eval, and so he had a psychological evaluation. And the guy was asking about his parents, and he was telling the story about how his parents died, and he started crying. And he called me immediately after. He knew I was he was a friend from grad school. He called me, and he said, I started crying. I told him about the death of my parents. I started crying. And he goes, do you think I lost the job? Do you think that's going to prejudice them against me? Are they going to think I'm weak because I can't? I like, no, you're talking about your parents dying, and they died in a plane crash, and here you are getting your pilot's license. Yes.
makes sense.
This is a normal part. If the psychologist is worth his or her salt, they're going to see that, hey, you had a loving relationship with your family and you lost your parents at an untimely time when you were in your early development, adult development. So anyway, yeah, there is this idea that, I mean, the mental health stigma is still out there, and the reality is there's probably more 10-year-olds and more 35-year-olds who are having thoughts like that 10-year-old Alex.
Yeah.
Like, what is this about? Are people going to miss me? Am I going to be gone? Do I matter? Do I have an impact in this world? People are having thoughts like that all the time, or thoughts about things that they can't control, the anxiety stuff, all the time. And do you have people in your world that you can talk to? Do you have friends? I'm a big believer that people don't need to be in therapy necessarily, but you've got to arrange to have therapeutic moments in your life. And you can do that a variety of ways. Sometimes people get that by going on a run. Sometimes they get it by being out in nature. Sometimes it's with sitting down with another human being and opening up and saying, this is the thought I had. Does this make me crazy? You know, and the world shrinks. The world gets smaller when you share your humanity with another person. And I think that that's part of what happens in therapy is you share your humanity with another person.
1,000,000%.
And they don't spit on you.
They don't judge you.
They don't castigate you, kick you out of their office.
I mean, I want to go back to that pilot. How crazy is it that in his mind, he felt like he had done something wrong by having that reaction to, because when I was hearing you tell it, it's like, no, of course you have that reaction. Yeah. Your parents died in a plane crash. You're applying to be a pilot. Like, it's 100% natural. But in his brain, and I can almost feel what he was feeling of like, I'm screwed for this. I shouldn't have shared it. They're going to think I'm crazy. Like, it's so heartbreaking to think that the self convinces you like I should be ashamed of this very natural, organic response.
Yeah, well, think about the culture of an airline. Like, to be an airline pilot, you have to be in control of so many things, right? Control. And I have a good friend and a colleague at the University of Minnesota. Her name's Pauline Bost, and she's kind of an emeritus faculty member. And she talks about this world that we live in. We like to control things. We like to master our environments. And so, you know, the cockpit of a plane, you have to master all those instruments, right? You have to know everything, and you've got 300 lives that are depending on you to be a master in that situation. And so when I'm in an interview and someone touches a button or I get hooked in some way about something that I wasn't expecting, I get blindsided, now I appear as though I'm out of control. I lost it. I lost my composure. I started crying. I couldn't control bodily functions, you know, like no wonder, because he knows what's expected of him as a pilot.
Yep.
And then to lose, quote unquote, lose control in that moment was potentially so shameful for him, and so like discouraging. Like, crap, I did all this work and now I'm lost. I've lost my opportunity because I cried about my parents' death. And so I think that's what society. That's the image or the message is: keep your stuff together. You know, don't lose your cool, and we can't always do that.
Sharing humanity, that is, and I think this is a good kind of place to wind down the first episode, which is the biggest takeaway that I have from therapy and my experience with therapy, and the reason I love it so much and so grateful for it, is because it has allowed me an opportunity to share my humanity in a safe environment. Yeah. And to express my deepest, unfilter my brain and unfilter my soul and say, this is what I'm thinking, this is what I'm feeling. And to not, to be met with someone who's not biased, it doesn't have any, it's not triggering to them. It's not going to trigger their issues with their parents. Like, I always explain therapy is like, you can say whatever you want and the person has to listen to you and they have to be nice to you. They have not a Hippocratic oath, but like whatever the therapist oath is, they can't be mean to you. Yeah. And that was really freeing to me. And it took me a little bit to get to that point. But once I realized the essence of therapy, it changed everything for me. It just unlocked a ton of, I feel a lot better now.
Yeah. It can be extremely freeing to have that experience.
But it is a little awkward, and it requires some like feeling each other out kind of a thing. But yeah, so I think this is a good place to wind things down. So I haven't come up with an outro yet. I don't know what that's going to be. Maybe it's like, hey, Alex, our time. That's our time. What do you guys always say?
Probably need to wrap up, or it looks like our time is up.
Looks like our time is up.
I've got someone else knocking on my door.
I got someone. Yeah, that's what it is. That's what my therapist always says.
But you just taught me a new word, outro. Like intro and outro. So
that is a term? Yes,
okay,
yes.
All right, I'm learning.
Yeah,
so.
That's great. Okay, well that is it for the inaugural. We will see. Maybe this will be the inaugural episode, the pilot episode, if you will. Maybe it won't.
Maybe
Who knows?
Be the last. Who knows?
Who knows? But stay tuned. Thanks for listening. I hope you've enjoyed it. And we will see you again soon, maybe. Okay, bye.